If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The land was quiet in that way it gets after something terrible, like the air itself is still deciding whether to move again. The fire had passed through a month ago, leaving behind the black ribs of fence posts and soil that crumbled under a boot. Now, a faint wind ran across the plain, stirring what little grass had survived. The only sound came from the loose board on the porch, knocking against the house each time the breeze shifted. Clara Hale stood inside that cabin, alone except for the echo of what used to be her life. The walls were stained with smoke, the table half-burned at one corner. She moved slowly, not out of weakness, but caution, as though every object might remind her of something she wasn't ready to feel. She had stopped crying weeks ago, not because the pain was gone, but because it had settled too deep to reach with tears. Her husband, Thomas Hale, had died in that fire. It had started in the barn, the dry hay catching fast under a summer wind. By the time she reached him, the roof had already folded in. The neighbors buried what was left beside the cottonwood tree at the edge of the property. They brought her bread and said things that sounded like kindness but felt like noise. After the third day, they stopped coming. The plains have a way of moving on before you do. Clara stayed because she didn't know what else to do. This cabin was the last place her life had shape. Leaving would have meant stepping into a world that no longer held a reason for her. So she patched walls, cleaned tools, and learned how to do the work Thomas had done. Not because she wanted to survive, but because habit was the only thing that didn't hurt. On a dry evening, when the horizon turned the color of dust and blood, a man appeared on the road, walking, not riding. He carried a rifle tied in a rag, and his coat was coated in trail grit. He stopped by the fence and waited, as if asking permission to exist there. Clara watched from the porch, her hand resting on the frame of the door. She didn't reach for the shotgun leaning by the wall. Not yet. Something in the man's posture didn't read as danger. It read as exhaustion. "You need something?" she asked, her voice rough from silence. He took a moment before answering, eyes scanning the burned edges of the land. "Water. Maybe work if you got it." His name was Elias Boone. Once, he'd been a bounty hunter. Before that, a ranch hand. Before that, a man with a family somewhere in Texas. Or so he said later, when he trusted her enough to tell it. He didn't speak of what he'd lost, but the way he looked at firelight told her he knew too much about it. That night, Clara let him sleep in the shed. By morning, he was already hauling water to the trough without being asked. He fixed the gate hinge, cleared the ash that had settled over the tools, and by dusk, the place looked less like a grave and more like a home someone might live in again. They spoke little. When they did, it was about things that had to be done: fence posts, feed, nails. Elias had a quiet way of moving, careful not to intrude on her space. He never entered the cabin unless invited, and even then, he stood near the door, hat in hand. Clara watched him sometimes from the window, the way he tested every board before stepping on it, the way he tied his horse as if it were a routine older than memory. At first, she thought he pitied her, but there was no pity in his voice, only respect. The kind that comes from recognizing another person's endurance. She started leaving an extra plate on the table at supper. He'd sit down only after she did. They didn't pray. They didn't talk about the dead. Sometimes, when the wind howled hard enough to make the walls creak, she caught herself listening for his breathing from the other room. It steadied her, more than she'd ever admit. Still, fear lingered in her, not of him, but of needing someone again. Losing Thomas had taught her what it cost to care. She'd buried love once. She wasn't sure she could survive doing it twice. Elias felt that distance. He'd seen it before, in the eyes of soldiers after war, in his own reflection after a job gone wrong. He didn't push. He stayed because the silence felt like something worth keeping. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west. Not rain, just wind and dust thick enough to hide the sun. Clara ran out to tie the shutters while Elias climbed onto the roof to secure the loose boards. The wind cut at their faces, grit stinging their eyes. "Get down from there," she called, the sound barely carrying through the gust. "Not till it holds," he shouted back, hammering one last nail before dropping to the ground beside her. They stood in the doorway as the storm pressed against the walls, both catching their breath. Her hands trembled, though she wasn't sure if it was from the wind or the sudden closeness of him. "You don't have to stay," she said after a moment. "I know," he replied, "but the roof would have come down without someone holding it." She looked at him, not as a stranger anymore, but as someone who understood the same kind of loss, someone who worked not out of hope but out of decency. And for the first time since the fire, she felt something shift inside her, small, unsteady but alive. That night, when the wind finally calmed, they sat at the table across from each other, the lantern throwing a dull light over their faces. Neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but not empty. It felt like the start of something they both needed. Not love, not yet, but the kind of trust that comes before it. Outside, the plane lay still, the ashes cold. Inside, two people who had nothing left began, without saying it, to build something they could stand on. Morning came slow across the plain, stretching light over the fields that still smelled faintly of smoke. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the air cool and the ground cracked but clean. Elias was already outside when Clara opened the door. He had a way of waking before sunrise, as if years of sleeping light had trained his body to expect trouble before it came. He was splitting kindling near the fence, each swing of the axe deliberate, not loud enough to startle the quiet that hung around the cabin. Clara watched for a while, standing in the doorway with her shawl tight around her shoulders. He noticed her, but didn't speak, only nodded once before going back to the rhythm of work. She liked that about him, his lack of performance. Most men she'd known filled silence with talk, as if afraid of it. Elias seemed to understand that silence was safer, easier to live in than words that carried expectations. Inside, she boiled water for coffee and tried not to think too far ahead. The farm was livable again, at least enough to pretend it had a future. But pretending wasn't the same as believing. She looked around the cabin, the patched walls, the missing chair, the blackened edge of the floorboards, and wondered if she was rebuilding a home or a monument to something that would never return. When Elias came in, his shirt clung to his shoulders from the heat, and the smell of pine sap and iron filled the room. He thanked her for the coffee, not out of habit, but as though he meant it. Then he sat, quiet, hands folded, eyes somewhere far beyond the window. She broke the silence. "You always wake that early? Can't sleep past dawn," he said. "Used to have to ride before light. Never broke the habit. Still looking over your shoulder?" He gave a faint smile, not amusement exactly, more like he recognized the question had weight. "You stop looking," he said. "You stop being alive." That was the first time she sensed what kind of man he used to be. The careful way he watched the horizon, the way he never faced a door without seeing where it led. It wasn't the behavior of a drifter who just liked his peace. It was the instinct of someone who had lived too long in danger. And though he said little, his eyes told her he carried a memory he couldn't leave behind. The rest of the morning passed with the rhythm of work. Elias checked the roof again, added another board, and mended a loose shutter. Clara took to sorting the tools Thomas had left behind, cleaning each handle, setting them in neat rows. It felt wrong at first, touching his things, but she forced herself through it. Tools were meant to be used, not remembered. She told herself that more than once. By midday, they ate together outside under the shade of the porch. She served stew left from the night before. He thanked her again, and they ate in the kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, just steady. When he finished, he wiped his hands on his jeans, took a breath, and asked something she hadn't expected. "You ever think of leaving?" he said. She looked at him sharply. "Why? Most folks don't stay after something like that." She glanced toward the open field where the fire had started. "There's nowhere else to go," she said simply. "And even if there was, I don't think I could leave this ground. Thomas is buried here. My folks, too. Feels like leaving them behind." He nodded, not arguing, only understanding. "I left once," he said. "Thought I could outrun what I'd done. Turns out you take it with you. Doesn't matter how far you go." "What did you do?" she asked before she could stop herself. Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Let the wrong man die," he said finally, "and let the right one walk free." Some things you don't fix. Clara didn't reply. The words hung in the air like heat. She didn't press him for more. She knew better than to ask a man to reopen a wound just to satisfy curiosity. Still, she understood him a little more after that. His quiet wasn't peace, it was punishment. That evening, she took a walk past the edge of the fence, the same path Thomas used to take to check the pasture. The sun had dropped low, the sky red and flat. She felt the weight of the past settle on her shoulders again, the kind that doesn't hurt all at once, but wears you down slowly, like a rock grinding underwater. When she turned back toward the cabin, she saw Elias standing on the porch, watching her. Not possessive, not intrusive, just making sure she came back. It startled her how that simple act made her chest tighten. She wasn't used to being looked after anymore. Grief had made her self-contained, almost cold. But this man, who barely spoke, had begun to thaw something in her she thought was gone. And it scared her more than any storm or stranger could. Later, as they sat by the fire, she found herself studying him again. The scar running along his jaw, the steady way he breathed, the faint tremor in his hands when the light hit them just right. He wasn't a man untouched by fear. He was a man learning to live with it, same as her. When the fire burned low, she said quietly, "You could leave tomorrow if you wanted. You've done enough here." He looked up from his cup. "You want me to go?" She hesitated. "I don't know." He nodded, accepting the truth without offense. "Then I'll stay until you do." Clara turned her gaze to the fire. The wood popped once, sharp and final. That was the last sound for a long time. In the days that followed, they fell into a rhythm. Morning chores, shared meals, the occasional laugh when something went right. Each day made it harder to tell where gratitude ended and something deeper began. She found herself waiting for the sound of his boots outside, measuring time by his movements. And though she didn't say it, part of her feared that when the work was done, when there was nothing left to fix, he might finally ride away. But Elias wasn't planning to. Not yet. Not while the cabin still needed mending. And not while Clara looked at him like she was trying to decide whether to trust the world again. He'd come to the edge of her life with no plan but survival. Now, without meaning to, he'd found one. And somewhere in that shared silence, between coffee at dawn and the sound of nails meeting wood, two broken people started to build something that might last, if only they had the courage to stay. The days settled into a steady rhythm, quiet but full. The kind of days that passed without announcement, each one blending into the next until it was hard to tell where time had gone. The cabin stood stronger now. The roof held, the windows had glass again, and the yard no longer looked like a grave. Clara had even planted a small patch of beans behind the well, a simple act that made the place feel like it could belong to the living again. Elias stayed busy. He always did. Work kept his mind from wandering to the places he didn't want it to go. He repaired saddles, fixed the fence line, hunted small game, and kept a watchful eye on the horizon. Clara noticed it, the way he scanned the open plain every morning, like a man expecting trouble. She didn't ask why. She figured he'd tell her when he was ready. At night, they sometimes shared stories in fragments. She talked about growing up in Missouri, about how she and Thomas came west with barely more than a wagon and a prayer. Elias talked less, but she learned pieces, the jobs, the towns, the men he'd hunted. He mentioned once that he'd worked under the name Boone, but that it wasn't the name he was born with. When she asked what his real name was, he only said, "Doesn't matter anymore." There were moments when she caught him staring into the fire, lost somewhere deep. He carried that look of a man who had lived through something that had changed him, something he'd never completely outrun. She knew that look. She saw it in herself every time she passed a mirror. Still, the days went on. The wind softened. The fields began to show color again. And for a short while, peace felt possible, until one afternoon, when a trail of dust appeared in the distance. It started as a faint smudge near the far hills, the kind that might have been a herd moving. But Elias saw it before Clara did, and the way he stiffened told her it wasn't cattle. He stepped off the porch and shaded his eyes. One rider, moving straight toward them. Clara followed his gaze. "You expecting someone?" "No," he said flatly. He took a slow breath, then added, "But he's expecting me." When the rider came close enough to make out, she saw a man in a brown coat, older than Elias, with a face like worn leather and a gun resting easy on his hip. He reined in a few yards from the fence, his horse kicking dust. "Boone," the man called, voice low but firm. "Didn't think I'd find you playing farmer." Clara glanced at Elias, waiting. He didn't move at first, just looked at the man with that same calm that made it hard to tell what he was thinking. Then he said, "Briggs." The name meant nothing to her, but the sound of it carried weight. Briggs smiled without warmth. "You got a way of disappearing. Been looking for you since Abilene." Clara crossed her arms. "Who are you?" "Someone who used to ride with your friend here," Briggs said, not taking his eyes off Elias. "He left town owing people answers. And money. But mostly answers." Elias's voice was steady. "You're a long way from Abilene." "Not far enough," Briggs said. "Word is a certain deputy wound up dead after you skipped out. Folks think you had a hand in it." Clara's stomach tightened. She looked at Elias, waiting for him to deny it. But he didn't. Not right away. He let the silence stretch until even the wind seemed to pause. "I didn't kill him," Elias said finally. "He got himself killed trying to frame me for something I wouldn't do. You know how that goes." Briggs dismounted, his boots crunching over the dry soil. "Doesn't matter how it happened. There's a warrant with your name on it. You can come quiet, or I can drag you." Clara stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You're not taking him anywhere." Briggs gave her a slow, condescending glance. "Lady, this ain't your concern." "The hell it isn't," she shot back. "He's done more for this place than any man I've met. You don't just walk in here with a story and expect me to hand him over." Elias's tone cut through the air, calm but edged. "Clara, go inside." She didn't move. "No." He sighed once, not angry, just tired. "Please." She looked at him, saw the quiet desperation under his eyes, and realized he wasn't trying to protect himself. He was trying to keep her out of something darker. Slowly, she stepped back toward the porch but didn't go inside. Elias faced Briggs again. "You don't want this fight," he said. "I want the bounty," Briggs replied. "And I'm not leaving without it." For a moment, the air between them felt like a stretched wire. Then Briggs's hand twitched toward his gun. Elias moved faster, not with panic, but with the sharp precision of a man who had done this before. One motion, draw, fire, and holster again. Briggs's gun fell to the dirt, his hand gripping his arm where the bullet had grazed him. Elias stepped forward and kicked the gun away. "You'll ride out of here," he said quietly, "and tell whoever's paying you that Boone's dead. You understand?" Briggs looked up, anger burning under his pain, but he saw something in Elias's eyes that made him hesitate. Something unshakable. After a long beat, he nodded. When the sound of Briggs's horse faded into the horizon, the world went still again. Clara came down the steps, her voice tight. "Who was he really?" Elias rubbed the bridge of his nose, weariness showing for the first time. "Used to be a friend," he said. "We rode together years back. Took a job we shouldn't have. It went bad and men died. The law blamed me because I was the one who got away." "Is it true?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, long enough for her to see that the truth wasn't simple. "It's true enough," he said. She didn't know whether to be angry or afraid, but what she felt most was disappointment in herself for caring about a man who clearly carried too much history. Yet when she looked at him again, standing there with his shoulders heavy and his hands shaking slightly from what he'd just done, she also felt something she didn't expect: empathy. He wasn't hiding behind lies. He was carrying his truth like a weight he'd never been able to set down. That night, after the sun fell and the land went dark, Clara sat on the porch while Elias packed his things. "You leaving?" she asked. He hesitated, the bag half closed. "If I stay, trouble come again. It always does." She stared at him, voice low but steady. "And if it does, we'll deal with it. Together." He stopped, his expression breaking just slightly. "You don't owe me that." "I don't," she said, "but I choose it." Elias didn't speak. He looked out across the plain, where the stars were faint through a haze of dust. After a long silence, he untied his horse and set the bag down instead of loading it. For the first time in years, he decided to stop running. And somewhere in that decision, in the quiet that followed, A new kind of trust began to take shape between them. It wasn't born out of safety or desire. It was built from something harder. Two people who had nothing left to hide, finally learning how to stay. The night after Briggs rode off, neither of them slept much. Clara lay awake, listening to the wind scrape against the walls, her mind replaying the gunshot over and over. It wasn't the sound that haunted her. It was the look in Elias's eyes when he fired. Calm, controlled, but burdened. That wasn't the look of a violent man. It was the look of someone who'd lived too long with violence and never wanted to touch it again. At dawn, she rose and stepped outside. Elias was already there, sitting on the porch steps with his hat pulled low, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. The light touched the scars on his jaw, the faint lines around his eyes. For the first time, she noticed how tired he looked, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too many years of running. "You didn't go," she said quietly. He shook his head. Didn't feel right. Clara folded her arms, unsure what she wanted to say. "If you stay, they might come looking." "They might," he admitted. "But I'm done running from shadows. If trouble finds me here, I'll face it straight." His words were simple, but something about the way he said them settled her. He wasn't promising her safety. He was promising honesty. And that meant more. She sat beside him. The sun was climbing, washing the plain in a pale, golden light. "What will you do now?" she asked. He thought for a while before answering. "Finish what I started. Make this place right. Then see what comes next." They spent the day working side by side, neither talking much. Elias replaced the splintered boards on the barn door, while Clara mended a shirt with thread she'd found in the bottom of an old drawer. The air smelled of hay and dust. The rhythm of normal work steadied them both. For a moment, life felt almost ordinary again. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. By late afternoon, a rider from town came up the trail. Sheriff Miles Dalrymple, a square-built man with a sunburned face and a lawman's wariness. He carried a small satchel and a folded piece of paper. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "You Boone." Elias straightened from his work, wiping his hands on a rag. "Depends who's asking." "Sheriff of Dry Creek," Dalrymple said, holding up the paper. "Got a wire from Abilene. Says there's been talk about a deputy named Klein. Seems he's been dealing dirty, extortion, bribery, and falsifying warrants. Your name's on one of those reports. Thought I'd come see if you're the same Boone they've been talking about." Clara's chest tightened. She set down her sewing and stepped forward. "What does that mean?" "It means," Dalrymple said carefully, "maybe your friend here wasn't the one they should have been chasing." Elias met the sheriff's gaze evenly. "You believe that?" Dalrymple shrugged. "I believe in proof." "You got any?" Elias hesitated, then went inside the cabin. He came back with a folded oilskin pouch and handed it to the sheriff. Inside was a single torn page, an entry from a ledger, names and amounts scrawled in a rough hand, all tied to Klein's initials. Dalrymple studied it for a long moment. "Where'd you get this?" "Off Klein's desk," Elias said. "The night everything went bad." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Then you might be clear, Boone. But the men who paid Klein won't like this being public. You might want to lay low until I can send word to the judge." Elias gave a dry smile. "Laying low's about all I've been doing lately." When the sheriff left, Clara exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "So it's over?" she asked. "Not yet," Elias said. "Klein's still out there. Men like him don't let go easy." That night, they ate quietly by the fire. The sound of crickets filled the gaps in conversation. Clara couldn't help studying him, his shoulders still tense, his eyes always flicking toward the door. She wanted to tell him he could stop now, that he didn't need to keep running or fighting. But she also knew he wouldn't believe it until the past stopped chasing him. A few days later, her fear proved right. Just before sunset, a horse thundered toward the cabin. Elias stepped outside with his rifle half raised. It wasn't Briggs this time. It was a younger man, nervous, wild-eyed, dust clinging to his jacket. He stopped hard, nearly toppling from his saddle. "You Boone," he gasped. "Who's asking?" Elias said. "Name's Tyler," the man said, catching his breath. "I rode from Abilene. The deputy, Klein, he's been caught. Turns out he's the one who framed you. Sheriff, there's clearing your name. Said to tell you, if you're alive, you can come back clean." Clara stared, hardly believing it. Elias stood there, not moving, his face unreadable. Tyler looked around the yard. Heard someone hired a man named Briggs to finish the job if the law didn't. You seen him? Elias nodded once. He won't be coming back. Tyler swallowed hard. Good. Then I'll ride back with word you're clear. He turned his horse, kicked up dust, and vanished into the open plain. Clara stepped closer. You're free, she said softly. Elias shook his head as if the word didn't fit. Free don't mean clean. It just means done. He went quiet after that, pacing the yard long after dark. We finally came inside. She asked, what happens now? I reckon I'll stay a while, he said. If you'll have me. Clara studied him in the dim firelight. This man who had walked into her life from a past full of ghosts and given her something she hadn't felt since the fire, steadiness. Then stay, she said. Not because you owe me, because you want to. He nodded slowly. That's the first thing I've wanted in a long time. They said nothing more that night. The fire burned low, throwing soft light over their faces. Outside, the wind moved across the plain, carrying away the last traces of dust and smoke. For the first time since the fire, and maybe for the first time in his life, Elias Boone felt like a man who could stop running. And Clara Hale, who thought the world had taken everything from her, began to believe that maybe it had given something back. By morning, the sky stretched wide and clean. The fences stood strong. The field shimmered faintly with green. There was still work to do. There always would be, but they had both decided to stay and face it side by side. And for people who'd once lived by leaving, that was enough. Spring came slow across the plains that year. The wind lost its bite, the grass returned in pale streaks of green, and for the first time in months, the land smelled alive again. The air around the cabin no longer carried the weight of smoke or fear. It carried the sound of tools, the clink of nails, and the soft rhythm of two people learning to live, not just survive. Elias had stayed. True to his word, he didn't speak of leaving again. Each morning he rose before dawn, checked the fence lines, then came back for coffee before the sun broke through the horizon. Clara had learned his patterns by heart now. The scrape of boots on the porch, the sound of him clearing his throat before speaking, the way he always looked at the sky before answering a question. He'd changed, though. The constant edge in him, that quiet readiness to fight or flee, had softened. He still carried his gun, but more like a tool now than a threat. When the sheriff's letter came weeks later confirming Klein's arrest and the bounty's withdrawal, Elias read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in the drawer beside the ledger page that had cleared his name. Then he said only, "It's finished." But for Clara, it wasn't just the past that had been set right. It was the present. She'd spent months living in a kind of half-life after the fire, doing the work, but feeling none of it. Now, with Elias there, the cabin had weight again. The air inside felt shared. She caught herself humming sometimes when she cooked, small and quiet, as though testing what happiness sounded like after so much silence. They built things together, small things that made the land whole again. A new chicken coop, a fence post line that ran straight this time, a little trough for rainwater under the eaves. Elias wasn't a talker, but he showed care in everything he did. If a nail went in crooked, he pulled it and did it again. If a tool broke, he mended it before the next day. Clara understood that kind of persistence. It was how she had survived too. At night, when the air turned cool, they sat by the fire and shared small pieces of themselves that hadn't yet been spoken. She told him about Thomas, how he had been kind, how he had worked hard, how his death had left her feeling like part of her had burned too. Elias listened without judgment, without pity. When she finished, he only said, "He sounded like a good man. I'd have liked to meet him." She asked about the years he'd spent running, the people he'd known, the towns he'd passed through. At first, he spoke vaguely, but as the days went on, his words filled in the spaces. He told her about the woman he once meant to marry, a rancher's daughter from Wichita who left him when his work started bringing trouble. He didn't blame her. Some people can live with ghosts, he said. Some can't. Clara watched him closely. And now, he looked at the fire. Now I want something that stays. A week later, he proved it. The morning was bright and clear. They were out near the pasture fixing the last section of fence when she noticed him stop working. He set down his hammer, removed his gloves, and turned toward her with that quiet seriousness she'd come to know. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About staying for good. Not as a guest. Not as someone passing through." She froze, unsure how to answer. He took a slow breath, steadying himself like a man about to speak something heavy. "You asked me once why I hadn't claimed you," he said. "The truth is, I didn't think I had the right. I was half a man when I came here. But this place, you've given me back what I lost. If you'll have me, I'd like to build a life here. Not over what's gone, just beside it." Clara's throat tightened. She looked at him, this quiet man who had walked into her grief and helped her find solid ground again. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her hands rough from work, her heart beating hard enough for her to feel it in her chest. "Then stay," she said finally. "Not to claim, to belong." He nodded, a single, sure motion. There was no grand gesture, no kiss, no speech. Just two people standing in the sunlight, making an agreement they both understood completely. That evening, they worked until dusk, finishing the fence. The sky turned bruised purple, the air cool and clean. Elias tightened the last wire while Clara held the post steady. When he was done, he looked over the length of their work, straight, even, strong, and gave a small nod of satisfaction. "Looks good," she said. "It'll hold," he replied. They walked back to the cabin together. The lamps were lit, the smell of supper drifted through the open door, and the quiet between them was easy now. They didn't need to fill it. After they ate, Clara opened a small box from the shelf. Inside was the ring that had melted in the fire, the last thing she'd kept from her husband. The metal was warped, fused into itself, no longer wearable. She placed it on the windowsill and looked out into the darkening plain. "This was my past," she said softly. "It doesn't have to be my future." Elias stood beside her. "We'll keep it here," he said, "where it belongs, with the rest of what we've built." And so they did. The days that followed were simple and full. Work, meals, laughter that came easier now. The land responded too. Grass thickened, crops took root, and life crept back in ways neither of them had dared hope for. Word from town spread that Boone was a free man, that the law in Abilene had cleared his name. No one came looking for him again. On a soft morning near the start of summer, Clara and Elias walked the fence line one last time, inspecting their work. The sky was wide, streaked with orange and blue, and the plains stretched out endlessly ahead. "You think it'll hold through the storms?" she asked. Elias smiled faintly. "It'll hold. We build it right." They stood there for a while, side by side, their hands brushing once, then staying close. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the smell of earth and promise. Neither spoke of what came next. They didn't need to. The story of their survival had already turned into the story of their life. And as the sun rose higher, lighting the cabin they'd rebuilt together, it was clear that the hardest part wasn't starting over. It was staying when it was easier to leave, staying when silence was all they had, staying long enough to let something good take root again. They had done that. The plains still held scars, but it also held them. Two people who had lost everything found each other and decided, finally, that staying was the bravest thing either of them had ever done.